The water came up fast. That was the thing nobody warned you about when they talked about the Montana floods of 1889, not the cold, not the mud, not the way the river smell got into everything and stayed. They warned you about loss, property, livestock, but nobody warned you that the water came up fast, and that when it didn't care what you'd planned for the rest of your life. Della had planned quite a lot. She'd planned to reach Billings by Thursday, where her cousin Nora had a spare room and a job waiting at a dry goods store. She'd planned to start over clean. No debts that weren't hers, no name attached to a man who'd drunk himself through their savings and then had the decency to die before she could divorce him. She'd planned to be somebody different by the time the first snow fell. Instead, she was standing on the roof of a collapsed stable, water to her ankles and rising, watching everything she owned float south. The trunk had gone first, then the carpet bag, then the hat she'd paid too much for in Missoula because she'd wanted, just once, to own something pretty without apologizing for it. She didn't cry. She'd stopped crying around the 3rd year of her marriage when she figured out it didn't change anything. She just stood there on the roof of somebody else's ruined-in stable and watched the brown water take her plans away, one by one, until there was nothing left to watch. That was when she heard the horse. It came out of the tree line on the eastern ridge, picking its way down the slope with the careful deliberateness of an animal that had done this before. The man on its back was large, not just tall, but built like something the mountains had made for themselves, wide through the shoulders, wearing a coat the color of old bark. He wasn't hurrying. He moved through the flooded lowland like the water didn't concern him, which was either stupidity or a kind of confidence Della hadn't seen in a long time. He pulled up maybe 20 feet from the stable roof and looked at her. She looked back. "You need pulling out," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, not unfriendly exactly, just economical, like a man who'd decided long ago that words were a limited resource and he wasn't going to waste them. "I need a great many things," Della said. "Pulling out would be a start." He didn't smile, but something shifted slightly in his expression, a fractional adjustment she couldn't name. He reached back and untied a coil of rope from his saddle. "Catch," he said, and threw it. She caught it. She'd grown up on a farm in Illinois before the city got its hands on her, and she still knew how to catch a rope. She tied it around her waist the way her father had taught her, double-knotted, and he backed the horse up slow and steady until she could drop off the roof edge and half swim, half drag herself to solid ground. The water was colder than she'd thought possible. It knocked the breath out of her in a way that was almost violent, and by the time her feet found the slope, her hands had gone numb and she was shaking hard enough that her teeth clattered together. He dismounted and handed her a blanket from his saddles without comment. It smelled like horse and wood smoke and something piney she couldn't identify. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Billings," she said. Eventually. He looked at the flooded valley below them, then at the sky, which had the particular grey weight of more rain coming. He looked at her, at the soaked dress, the bare hands, the complete absence of any bag or bundle or any sign that she possessed a single thing beyond what she was wearing. "Eventually is going to be a while," he said. His name was Harlan. That was all he offered, and only because she asked directly. He had a cabin 2 hours up the mountain. "Above the flood line," he said, like that was the only relevant fact, and he was going back to it. She could come or she could stay. He said it the same way, equal weight on both options, which told her that while he wasn't indifferent to her survival, he had also decided not to be responsible for her choices. She went. The ride up was steep enough that she had to lean into the horse's neck on the switchbacks, and Harlan walked most of it, leading the animal, never looking back to check on her. The rain started again. Around the 2nd hour, light but persistent, and by the time the cabin came into view through the timber, Della had reached that particular state of cold and exhaustion, and just goes quiet, The cabin was small. 2 rooms, she would discover. A main room with a stone hearth and a plank table and 2 wooden chairs, and a back room that was clearly his, from which she would stay separate. The floor was swept. The woodpile was stacked tight and high against the north wall. Everything in it had a purpose, and everything was where it belonged. He put water on to heat without being asked. She sat in front of the fire, with the blanket still around her shoulders, and watched the wood catch and tried to stop shaking. "There's a spare tick in the loft," he said, moving around the room with an efficiency that suggested he'd never wasted emotion in his life. "Blankets in the chest, you can have what's there," she sank. He looked at her then. Really looked. The way a man looks at a problem he's trying to understand. He spent, not unkind, just assessing. "Can you work?" he asked. She thought about all the things she'd done in her 28 years. The farm in Illinois, the hotel laundry in St. Louis, where she'd worked 60-hour weeks before she married, the garden she'd kept alive through 2 droughts because she refused to let anything under her care just die. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and that was the entirety of the negotiation. She didn't know, yet, how long the road to Billings would stay flooded. She didn't know that the main pass would be washed out for 6 weeks, or that the telegraph line was down, or that her cousin Dora would assume she'd simply changed her mind and fill the position at the dry goods store with someone else. She didn't know any of that sitting there by the fire, with her dress steaming and her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water that was finally warm. She only knew that she was alive, and that the shaking had almost stopped, and that the man named Harlan had gone out to sea to his horse, and hadn't asked her a single question she didn't want to answer. That last thing, she thought, was rarer than it should have been. The first week was practical, and nothing else. She learned the routines the way you learn a foreign language, by immersion, by watching, by getting it wrong, by doing it again. Harlan was up before light. She started getting up before light too, mostly because lying in the loft listening to him move around below felt stranger than getting up and being useful. He didn't comment on this. He simply made room for her at the stove and showed her, once, wordlessly, how he liked the fire laid in the morning, and then never mentioned it again because once was enough. He ran trap lines on the northeast slope. She didn't ask to come the first time. She asked the second week, when she'd gotten her bearings enough to be bored, and he looked at her for a moment and said, "Dress warm," which she took for yes. The lines were set over a 2-mile stretch. Following a creek she didn't have a name for, he moved through the timber without making noise, in a way that took her several trips to begin to understand. It wasn't just about being quiet. It was about where you put your feet, about reading the ground before you stepped on it. She tried to do what he did. She was loud by comparison, but she got quieter, week by week, and he never mentioned the improvement, which was somehow more encouraging than if he had. She learned to skin a rabbit, she learned to split wood, without catching the axe in the grain, and having to yank it free 3 times. She learned that the water from the creek upstream ran cleaner than the lower reach, and she learned to heat enough of it every 3rd day for a proper wash, because she had decided early on that she would not let the difficulty of a thing become a reason not to do it. This was the part the old stories never bothered with, the actual logistics of keeping yourself human when the hot water wasn't just on a tap. She used a heavy pot and a wooden bucket, and more fuel than it seemed worth, and it was always worth it. She felt like herself again afterward, in a way that was hard to explain, but that had to do with dignity, she thought, with the particular kind of respect you owe yourself. Harlan didn't say anything about it, but one morning she came back from the creek to find he'd moved the largest pot to a more accessible hook over the fire, and added a second hook beside it. He'd done it quietly, without ceremony. The same way he did everything. She thought about that for a long time. The days arranged themselves. She cooked, better as the weeks went on, learning what was in his stores and how to make the most of it. He hunted and ran the traps and split the wood and did the 10,000 small maintenance tasks that keeping a mountain cabin alive required. They ate together at the plank table without much conversation, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that meant there was nothing being avoided, just nothing that needed saying right then. She asked him questions sometimes, careful ones, spaced out, the way you'd feed a fire, not too much at once. She learned that he'd been in Montana 11 years, that he'd come from Pennsylvania originally, from a small town near Pittsburgh, and that he never said why he'd left. And she never pressed. She learned that he'd built the cabin himself over 2 summers, that he traded furs in a town called Grafton 12 miles north, and that he went there every 6 weeks, unless the weather made it impossible. She learned that he'd had a dog once. He mentioned it once, in passing, referring to a particular spot by the hearth as where she used to sleep, and then he didn't mention it again, and neither did she. But she thought about it, about a man who lived this far from everything, choosing to give a dog a specific, remembered place. He was not what she'd expected from the first sight of him coming through the floodwater. She'd catalogued him quickly in those first minutes, the way a woman alone learns to catalogue men. Size, expression, the way he held himself, whether he looked at her like something to be managed or something to be afraid of. He'd looked at her like a problem to be solved, which was different from both, and which she'd found she could live with. He was not cruel. She would have left if he were cruel. Flood or no flood, washed-out pass or no washed-out pass. She'd already spent years with a man, and she'd promised herself when she left that she would walk barefoot through the snow before she let that happen again. But Harlan's silences were not the silence of anger building. They were just silence. The way the mountain was silent. It didn't mean anything except itself. The hard thing was different than she'd expected. The hard thing was that she kept waiting for the moment when he would become something she recognized from experience, something she knew how to prepare for, and it kept not happening. He was consistent. He was fair. He worked as hard as he asked her to work. He said what he meant, and meant what he said, and he didn't seem to require anything from her except competence and honesty, both of which she had in quantity. It was disorienting, frankly. She found herself watching him sometimes when he didn't know she was watching. At the table in the evening, reading one of the 3 books he owned by firelight, or outside in the early morning, checking the sky for weather. He had a way of being still that she associated with things that were deeply rooted, trees, rock, formations. Things that had been somewhere long enough that the land had shaped itself around them. She wasn't sure exactly what she was watching for. She only knew that she'd stopped dreading the morning the pass cleared. The pass cleared on a Tuesday in October, 6 weeks after the flood. One of the Grafton men brought word when Harlan came back from his trading run. The road to Billings was open, the stage running again, and the telegraph was back up as of last week. Harlan told her at supper. Straightforward, no particular inflection. Just the facts. She said thank you, and passed him the bread and didn't say anything else that night. She lay in the loft for a long time after the fire burned low, listening to the windwork at the corners of the cabin. She had $37 she'd sewn into the hem of her dress before she left St. Louis, which was on her body, which had survived the flood because it was on her body. Enough to present herself at Nora's door and explain and start the next version of her life. The plan was still good. The plan had always been. The plan was still. She thought about the pothooks he'd moved without saying anything. She thought about the quiet at the table that never felt empty. She thought about the moment 3 weeks ago when she'd come back from the trap line in a freezing rain and he'd had coffee waiting. Not because she'd asked, not because it was unusual, just because it was a cold day and she'd been out in it. She was not a woman who made decisions carelessly. She'd made one careless decision at 22 and spent 5 years paying for it. But she also knew the difference now between a place you stayed because you had nowhere else to go and a place you stayed because something in it was worth staying for. She got up before light and went downstairs. He was already at the stove. He looked up when she came down the ladder. Not surprised, exactly, but attentive in the way he got when something required his full consideration. "The stage runs Thursday," she said. "It does," he said. She went to the window and looked out at the slope in the grey pre-dawn dark. The timber was going gold at the edges. The creak sound was lower now than it had been in the summer, thinner, and in a month it would be ice. "I want to stay through the winter," she said, "if that's agreeable." He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she turned to look at him. "It's agreeable," he said. She nodded. He poured her coffee and set it on the table, and she sat down, and outside the window the light came up slow over the eastern ridge, the same way it always did, indifferent and reliable, and very, very beautiful. She pulled her hands around the cup and felt the warmth move into her palms. The plan had always been to reach Billings by Thursday and start over clean. She had reached, instead, something she hadn't known she was looking for. A life that fit the shape of who she actually was, built out of cold mornings and hard work, and a man who showed you what he meant, rather than telling you. Outside, the first birds started in the timber. She drank her coffee and didn't say anything else, because nothing else needed saying. Neither did he.